Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you who follow the stream, and of course also to our speakers here on the virtual panel from wherever you are joining us today. Welcome to this session. My name is Birte Fähnrich. I work as a researcher at the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities here in Berlin, and I have the pleasure to moderate this discussion on trust in science today. Last night I thought quite some time about how to introduce this topic, trust in science. So of course, I could have talked about the importance of trust in science. We all know, or we all emphasize, that trust in science is an important issue. I could have also linked the topic to experiences from the pandemic, but instead I thought a good and maybe also honest starting point would be to tell you what I thought when I received this invite to moderate this session. So when I received this invitation some weeks ago, I felt rather ambiguous about this topic, I have to admit. So my spontaneous reaction was, do we really need another panel discussion on trust in science? Probably many of you will agree that the trust issue has been booming in recent months, and at least in my environment or my personal filter bubble, there has been a lot of alarmism, simplification, misperception, or even strategic misinterpretation around the issue of trust. And unfortunately, related discussions often bring not too many new insights. But let's go back to the moment of the invite. So I said my first reaction was rather hesitant, but the second reaction was, look which great people they got for the panel. So of course, I wanted to moderate the session, and with these four amazing colleagues, and of course with you in the audience, this will hopefully be an inspiring discussion where we will manage to leave these beaten tracks of the debate and take a fresh look where we may be able to discuss very different concepts of trust in science, where we can dig deeper into the empirical evidence that we have, for instance, for different contexts, different countries, different disciplines, and different settings of science communication and related trust issues. And also where we can reflect more profoundly about the functions of and reasons for trust, but also of distrust, for instance, at the intersections of science and politics and in the context of the pandemic. Of course, this is an ambitious program for only 75 minutes. However, this is not only my wish list for this discussion, but as far as we've talked before, also resonates with the issues that are important to our speakers today. So I'm happy to introduce our panelists, and I will start with Rainer Bromme. Rainer, good to have you here. Rainer is a senior professor for educational psychology at the University of Münster in Germany, and his research focuses on epistemic belief, expert-lay communication, especially in the context of health communication, and of course, trust in science, especially in the context of the digital media environment. We then have John. Good morning, John. John is joining us from the US. He holds a chair for public relations at Michigan State University, and he is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. In his research, John studies public opinion about science and scientists' opinions about the public, and he also explores the relationships between media use, public engagement activities, and health and environmental risk perception. And then we move back to Europe, first to Ireland. Maria Baghramian, welcome Maria, good to have you on the panel. Maria is a professor in the School of Philosophy at the University College Dublin. She's also a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and therefore she has contributed to different working groups by ELEA that also dealt with the issue of trust. She is especially interested in epistemic trust and the role of scientific experts in policy decisions. And last but not least, let me welcome and introduce Tracy Brown from the UK. Welcome, Tracy. Tracy brings in her perspective from trust work and practice. So she's the founder and director of Sense About Science, and the focus of her work at this non-profit organization is to ensure that the public has access to the same evidence and reasoning as decision makers have, and thus to mobilize for more transparency in the use of evidence and policy making. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. And before we open the discussion, you, Rainer, John, Maria, and Tracy will give us some food for thought. So we will now hear your flashlight talks, and we'll stick to the order in which I've just introduced you. Just one very short note to the audience. We are very much looking forward to your questions. So please use the Q&A function. We will have the time to allow 1 or 2 immediate questions after each talk, and then we'll discuss in more depth after the statements. So Rainer, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Okay, I wonder if you could see my slides now.
Yes, looks good.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so my suggestion for today, for one of the topics to talk about today is is what I would call the need for informed trust, or what I suggest is to discuss about the concept of informed trust. And my reason for this is that that such an idea about informed trust might be necessary in order to understand the recent development. For example, the development which has been already mentioned today, that in many countries, recent surveys have shown an increase in the public's trust in science, obviously related to the COVID pandemic. Here are data you can see here, data from Germany, which clearly show an large increase from pre-COVID to within COVID times. And this increase, as it has been reported for Germany, is in accordance with other countries. And so the overall conclusion is the public is feeling more positive about science. But it is also discussed that if that COVID-related increase in the public trust in science is a temporary, shallow, or even spurious effect, is it just a rally around the flag phenomenon in a crisis, or is it a sustainable increase? Sustainable in the double sense of persistency, will it remain so high, and also in the sense of breadth, will it be transferable to other urgent issues, utmost the issue of climate change? Of course, an empirical answer can be given only in the future, but my main argument here is that looking for an empirical answer also requires a theoretical idea about a kind of trust in science which would not be shallow or spurious. And in other words, for thinking about about this issue, I would argue that it is necessary for us as researchers, but of course also as for us as practitioners when we are trying to contribute that this increase is really sustainable, that we need an idea of a normative and simultaneously feasible concept about trust in science. Normative based on rational and legitimate reasons why citizens should have this kind of trust in science, and feasible, with this I mean based on empirical and conceptual findings about the processes, conditions, goals, and limitations of citizens' encounter with science. And I would like to explain that very shortly, what I mean with this idea about informed trust. Others would call that enlightened trust or critical trust. In any way, it's a normative idea about how trust should be, trust in science should be. And it's an idea about a rational knowledge, understanding-based judgment about whom to believe and thereby what to believe. And I would like to illustrate that by a very recent and heatedly debated example from Germany. At present, within Germany, there's a hot debate about the issue of COVID vaccination for children between 6 and 16. And the arguments are this should be recommended only for just the vulnerable kids, or it should be generally recommended, or it should be even mandatory for access to schools. And there are at present very heated controversies among scientific advisors, further scientists, and especially the federal and state secretary of health. They are in clear conflict, for example, at present with the federal advisors. And the question is, whom should citizens believe and why should they believe the scientists at all? And I think when we try to answer that question, we have to develop, or implicitly we always rely on an idea about informed or critical trust in science. And I think it is to develop such a concept of informed trust in science is possible, and it is also feasible if we look at the the elements or the beliefs which might be part or which might be the basement for such informed trust. And what you see here is a list of elements of knowledge or domains of knowledge, or one could say kinds of beliefs which are necessary, for example, to make informed judgments about that vaccination issue. And what is printed in green are those beliefs where, at least with regard to Germany and with regard to surveys in Germany, one could argue that there are already existing belief systems shared by relevant parts of the German population. So it is not totally idealistic or unrealistic to argue that it is possible to foster such an idea of informed trust. And this leads me to my conclusion. Researchers as well as practitioners need a concept of informed or critical or enlightened trust. And such a concept must not be a wish list about beliefs citizens should have about science. Instead, it should be feasible in the sense of relating ideas about a desirable kind of trust in science to what is known empirically about citizens' capacities for rational trust judgment. And in terms of that, I would argue that discussing about an idea of what informed trust could mean is also discussing about a kind of research program about just such citizens' capacities for making informed trust judgment. And one final side note, so to say, I think such a focus on what do we think the general public should have, which kind of trust is also has some charm of being less oriented on people's biases and deficits and more on people's capacities. So to sum up, I would be very happy to learn about your ideas about which kinds of trust in science should be achieved and supported in science communication.
Aina, thank you very much. So we have no questions from the audience yet, but actually I have a question for clarification. So my question refers to this notion of informed. Do you mean, or I could think of making people more scientifically literate could resonate with this notion of informedness. Do you mean that? Do you mean that we need to increase literacy or scientific literacy, or is this being informed something different?
I think scientific literacy is a kind of approach, so to say, to discuss about that. I think scientific literacy is much too small. I would like to exemplify that for example, understanding that controversies among scientists are necessary and helpful is clearly a part of scientific literacy. And such an understanding of such beliefs, of course, are part of what I have in mind as informed, as the knowledge basis for informed judgments about whom to trust and whom not to trust. But, for example, telling apart normative, goal-oriented and fact-oriented issues, which is in the COVID, it came up in the debates in Germany, at least about COVID, there were many cases of a severe mixing up these normative goal-oriented issues and fact-oriented issues. And the capacity, the cognitive capacity, the knowledge to sort that out, these two aspects out, is clearly beyond what at least traditionally was subsumed under scientific literacy.
Thanks. Thanks, Rainer. So we move back to the US and John will give his flashlight talk. So John, are you there? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think starting my video and I will share my screen. I think Rainer needs to
you can stop
share the
sharing,
screen
please.
here.
Great.
Yeah. Go.
John,
Perfect. And then let me just get myself all set up here with various screens open. Are you looking at my screen now? Perfect. And I just want to make sure to get the timing right. And so, yeah, thank you very much for letting me share with you, and Elena for sharing those thoughts. There's many things I want to get into, I would love to respond to, but we'll get to that in the discussion. And I think so for my sort of mandate to start is to talk a little bit about trust and trustworthiness in the United States, and then just some thoughts of how we might productively talk about it. Here we go. And I think Raina sort of hinted towards this, but for me, one of the key things if we're talking about trust is really, I think I find it a little bit unhelpful to talk about trust and not talk about trustworthiness. And because I think it's really important for these discussions, and I think where a lot of these discussions get challenged, especially from the perspective of communication, where a lot of my work is about working with scientists, is what should we say? What should we do? How should we behave? How should we say it? And if you get to that level of communication, talking about trust in general may not be as helpful. And so it's worth, I think, differentiating this idea of trust as a behavior. I'm willing to take that vaccine. I'm willing to make myself vulnerable to the decisions of some other group, versus trust as beliefs. And particularly we know from Raina's work and from work across the social sciences that there's lots of different dimensions of trustworthiness beliefs or fairness beliefs, including, do you think that scientist is honest, they have integrity? Do you think they're caring, benevolent, warm? Do you think that they're willing to listen, open to other people's perspectives? Do you think they're similar to you and share your values? And ultimately, do you think that they're competent? Do you think they know what they're doing? Those are all discrete beliefs. In terms of Raina's point about informed trust, or I would say informed trustworthiness, those beliefs can be correct. And the nice thing about beliefs is beliefs can be correct or they can be incorrect, but they're still beliefs. And if they're correct, you might call them knowledge almost. And so I would argue, I'm going to argue in a second here, that we really need to come back to this idea of differentiating trust and trustworthiness. But just a little bit of data from the US. I was looking at some questions in the Q&A as well. And so we have data in the US for a lot of years now, going back to the 1970s, really showing that of all other groups in the world, scientists, the scientific community seems to be the one community where, in this case, confidence, which I'm not exactly sure what the word confidence means, but at least confidence, as in the survey question, has stayed relatively stable, where it's gone down for medicine, it's gone down for the press, it's gone down for industry. But we have this general idea that we shouldn't be too worried because confidence in science has stayed relatively stable over time, unlike every other group. But again, that's just this one word, confidence, which I don't know where that fits in terms of, that's sort of closer to a trust as a behavior, kind of, rather than a belief. For a long time, that was really the only good data we had over time. In the recent years, we've been fortunate that the Pew Research Center, a woman named Carrie Funk, has taken the lead on building out science surveys at the Pew Research Center. And so again, they use some of the same questions that are in that other data from this national high quality face-to-face survey of about 2,000 people every year. Carrie's also been doing it through the Pew Center. And again, she showed, similar to the data that Raina showed, was that it looks like maybe there's a slight uptick in, again, confidence. We get some of these other questions that, like, ethical standards, which I would think would fit into that sort of integrity, honesty space. And again, we see maybe, and this is medical doctors specifically, and so you can see maybe there's a bump up there. And then we also, again, we have these overall views. Sometimes the trust literature falls into the people perception literature as well. What I really like, though, and unfortunately they haven't done this since 2019, Pew has done some surveys where they differentiate based on those different sort of trust. They have the overall measure of how do you view a group, but also that they get down into these specific beliefs about the groups. And that's really important, particularly from a communication perspective, because you start to see, well, yeah, people think that scientists in general are pretty competent, but they start to get a little more fussy when it comes to, are they honest? Are they caring? What's their especially their motivations? And I don't have the data here, but you also saw this across the world in the Wellcome Trust Gallup survey. It's great because they broke it down by these different sort of specific trustworthiness beliefs. And you could really see that competence, we're doing all right when it comes to the scientific community, but when it comes to these other things, we're doing less well. And I want to just really push this point home, is because the reason this really matters is focus on beliefs. Because if I say to you as a communicator, you need to build trust, I don't know where I go in terms of strategy. But if I say, we've done some work and it looks like people don't think you're willing to listen. They feel like you're closed. When you do that, now we can really start to think about, oh, okay, well, people don't think I'm willing to listen. If I am really willing to listen, we can't do this if it's not true. You can't lie about your willingness to listen. That would be wrong. But if you do, you could start to think, well, how could I behave in a way that makes it more likely people will believe that I'm willing to listen? What could I say differently? How could I say it differently? Where should I say it? Where do I need to go? And so we can start, it's really important to think about those sort of sub-dimensions of trustworthiness. And just this one last thing, this is fun research that's sort of in progress right now. One of the things we were worried about is scientists saying, well, it's not ethical for me to go out and spend time. If I only have 60 minutes to give a talk, I can't spend time telling you why I'm honest, telling you why you should see that I'm honest or willing to listen. So we did a survey on COVID and GM food, about half, we split the sample. And what we found, the ones that are in dark, generally speaking, people want scientists, at least they say they want scientists to provide trustworthiness related information. So this is about how important would it be to provide that information. We also asked how much time. It was about people want scientists to take time from a 60-minute talk to share why should you be trusted? How do we know you're willing to listen? How do we know that you're honest? How do you know what's your motivations? And so ultimately what I think that means to me is that, first of all, we need to make sure that we're being good when it comes to trust. That we shouldn't, of course, again, we can't communicate that we're trustworthy if we're not doing everything we can to be trustworthy. But once we feel confident in that, I think it's okay to share that information. I think organizations need to do research to find out how they're perceived. Then I think we need to think about, well, what are the things that we could be sharing, true things that we could be sharing to help that. And I'll stop there, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, sure. So thanks a lot, John. Thanks also for this this differentiation of different concepts that we actually should look at, trustworthiness. There's one question that fits quite nicely that rather relates to the object of trust. And Shreya Ghosh is asking that there's asked whether there would be a popular tendency to confuse trust in science with trust in scientists. So how would you estimate that?
So I've wanted to do that research to sort of do experiments where you essentially vary what you ask. My impression is no. I mean, we're people pay attention to people. I mean, so yes, people may have some sort of epistemic general belief in like the value of science, but they don't trust scientists. But if you trusted scientists and you didn't trust, so if you trusted science, had strong positive beliefs about all the good things that science can do, but you didn't trust scientists, what would be the point, right? And so at the end of the day, science is a human activity. And if we want people to take the advice of science, what we really mean is we want people to take the advice of scientists. And so if we want people to take the advice of scientists, then I think as a practical matter, I'm not sure. So we could spend a whole bunch of time, another way to say it is we could spend a whole bunch of time getting people to think science is the greatest thing in the world, but if they don't believe that scientists are doing science, then what's the point? And so I really do think that the scientist focus is what makes sense from a strategic perspective and ultimately amounts to the same thing.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, John, for your talk and the short response. We move from this rather general view on science and trust in science and the broader public to the interaction of also science and politics, and also to the concept of distrust. And Maria is introducing her thoughts on this. Maria, you have to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I'll try to share my PowerPoint now. Which for some reason I'm not able to find, even though we tried this before, but I'll go through it anyway with you as soon as I can. Maybe Tracy can take over while I'm sorting things out here.
Okay.
Is that okay for you, Tracy?
That's
okay.
Fine for me. Yeah, that's fine for me. Okay, hi. Well, I think there's a theme emerging from these presentations that's going to be very interesting to explore. So Aaron says about science, and we promote sound science and evidence for the public. Our ethos is public-led, expert-fed. And what do we mean by that? What do we do? Well, we equip people to ask good questions. This is our Ask for Evidence campaign, where we help people to formulate questions about the issues that shape their lives or the claims that they encounter. And we equip the research community to answer those questions in human. And we work with both communities, researchers and the public, to advocate for a public sphere in which it is possible to discuss research openly and honestly. So this is our All Trials campaign that has achieved changing regulations around the world to ensure that all clinical trial results are published, something that the public and researchers join together to achieve. And this is our transparency of evidence framework, which is a way of ensuring that policymakers communicate the evidence behind policy decisions with their voters. So we work in a kind of triangle of decision makers, researchers, and the public. Now, I very much agree with people who are saying let's not get too hung up about there being a big decline in trust. There clearly isn't, in terms of the sorts of things that John's just talked about. The research shows that there's a very strong support for science and scientists, and if anything, it has increased throughout COVID. However, I'd make a slightly different distinction in the way that we look at trust, because I think that those kinds of polls go alongside a great anxiety in the scientific community. And it's important that we unpack this and understand there does seem to be something going on here between scientists and the public that is of concern. And I make a distinction, I use Matthew Bennett, the philosopher's distinction between epistemic trust and recommendation trust. Epistemic trust is that we trust people to pursue a path to the truth, that we tend to do so in a way that's competent, that's honest, that's tested, that's insightful, all the things that that Raina and John have talked about. And that, I think, is where we end up with the question of what's trustworthy, and something I'm sure Maria is going to talk a bit more about. What can we do to make it clear that path to the truth that the research community is pursuing is one that we should trust. But then we have recommendation trust, and I think we're seeing a lot of this throughout the discussions around COVID. And with recommendation trust, we have to accept that we should do what we're told. And that's a very different set of requirements. That requires us to believe that the interests of the people saying that are the same as our interests, and that perhaps our loss would be their loss too. Now, I would ask everybody involved in this discussion and this despair about the public to take a huge step back at the minute and imagine, from the perspective of people looking at what scientists are recommending in the context of lockdowns, for example. When you have a tenured position, you own your own home, you have a nice big garden, right? That is a very different proposition in terms of your ability to absorb and act on evidence than if you live in a small 2-bedroom flat in a centre of a city with 4 kids all trying to do their online lessons around the kitchen table, or if you're on a 0 hours contract and you're wondering how to meet the rent next month. It's just a very different proposition. And it's not just economically so, it's also many other kind of assumptions that are made about the priority that things like health or a particular disease should have in our lives. And I think one of the things that has been very clear throughout this pandemic is that a lot more sensitivity is needed in the leap that's being asked from people when they have to follow recommendations. And it's actually, something that we have to kind of consider. And sometimes I think science has to be a bit humble about. Scientists are professional middle-class people for the most part in those kinds of positions. And you have to be a bit humble about the fact that your interests just are not the same as somebody working as an Amazon delivery driver on a 0 hours contract. And what happens in society and the consequences of that for you are not the same. And that is a reasonable, rational position for somebody to take in the public sphere. Right? That doesn't mean that they should end up in a position where they cut off their ability to use good questions and get them answered. So that's, I think, the challenge that we have. Before I just go on very briefly to give you a few thoughts on that and how we do that, I want to just add that when scientists are confronted by hostility or apparent, sort of denialism, as it's now often called, and they call it denialism as though it's an affliction, what comes across is that they're asking for trust, but what comes across is no trust in the public. So sort of ridicule and despair, complaints about ignorance, and these kinds of things are actually very undermining of a two-way street in trust. I also think we've seen a lot in the way of overstepping, people actually being unwilling to understand other spheres of research. So for example, we have epidemiologists with very strong opinions about the effects of loss of education on children. We have disease epidemiologists making very strong statements in public. And again, I think there is a kind of considerable basis there for people to become rather suspicious about the motives and the self-interest that lie behind people's recommendations. There has been very little attention to the trade-offs that people are having to make in their lives in terms of, for example, and we see it in climate change. You know, yes, there's a climate priorities, a climate emergency, but very little discussion about the implications of that for and different policies to ameliorate that for different groups of people. So I think there is a suspicion that the interests are not, you know, that narrow spheres of concern are elevated and not embedded in a wider social context. And I would say that in some areas, particularly in the States, some extent in the UK and Ireland, and I think less so in other places. I think the Netherlands has done quite well and Germany's doing quite well, but orthodoxy in response to some issues where scientists, for all that we like to talk about science being a great way of asking questions and open inquiry, orthodoxy is something that I think is often the message that comes across. It's the opposite of what we want people to understand about the nature of scientific inquiry, and using language like denialism and so on only underlines that, I'm afraid, for the wider public, regardless of whether you think it's a very good definition. Very briefly, these are things. So we've been working with conspiracy theorists, people who are minded towards conspiracies, not actually people who are making money out of publishing conspiracies. We've been working with people who are minded to it, to talk to them about the kind of conversations that help them. What we often find is they're no different from anyone else, really, who is asking skeptical questions or feeling that they don't just believe what authorities tell them. And we think there is a very large space for researchers to kind of line up alongside the public, alongside people who are asking these questions, and actually help to equip them with questions that will genuinely take them to accountability or genuinely get to the heart of the matter that's troubling them. Many of the concerns that people have are no different from the concerns of people who buy into science. They're just expressed differently. And I think a lot more work is needed to help people to ask good questions, and we can come on to discuss that. As people in chat have indicated and the Q&As have indicated, uncertainty is a huge part, understanding uncertainty is a huge part of helping people to navigate claims about scientific evidence and what we should do about them in the public sphere. And what scientists and science communicators forget so often is to provide some kind of context against which the drips of information, the studies and findings and recommendations, against which to kind of map them. Most people just don't have that kind of map that you have when you go native and you work amongst the research community. And a simple map like this, even, to show people where we find science to be settled and where we think that new information is going to turn things around, is very helpful to people. We're just not giving people enough maps, enough navigation, enough understanding of what institutions are, how research is done, and so on. And finally, I think we need to start popularizing a lot more the kind of questions that people can ask decision makers. So I think researchers should be on the side of the public, asking people in positions of authority to account for how they're using evidence. And in that way, I think, show trustworthiness in relation to recommendation trust, rather than just in relation to epistemic trust.
Tracy, thanks a lot. I really like your idea of sense making or linking this whole thing to the individual settings of people and their sense making in their everyday life. So colleagues of mine did a little study on that, so I'm quite aware of this concept, and I think that's really useful and always also really useful to make researchers and science communicators rethink actually the settings of science communication. However, my question is somehow, if we have this diagnosis that we have somehow, let's say, societal burnout at the moment, and people just can't take more information, and just, maybe there's some kind of over demand. How should we behave? How should we tackle this? How can we work with this?
Well, I think a really useful thing to do is to actually understand what questions people have. I think John mentioned earlier, do things by invitation, ask people what it is they're grappling with and what they want to know the answers to, and then go through with them. I mean, we talk about this in the COVID conspiracy theory guide, because rather than anyone who's ever had a discussion with someone who's a bit more of a committed conspiracy theorist will know that they'll just keep coming at you with, it becomes a fact war, and it's not really helpful to anyone. But actually figuring out what they're worried about and what their question is, and then sort of quite, thinking about, well, actually, how do we go on this journey together to figure out the answer to that, and how do we make sure that we're not led astray on that, and I think validating people's questions and then helping them to find a route to getting them answered is the way forward.
And who should be in charge of that one? So should this be science, or rather professional science communicators, or politicians, or who is in charge?
I think in many areas of science, there's a long and noble history of being on the side of the people. I mean, statisticians are the people who helped us as a society to frame things like, women's role in society compared to men's. Statisticians were the people who worked with us so that we started to, many centuries ago, started to count, cargo on ships as the things that they were, which is slaves and people. I mean, it's only when you can help people to describe something, and in a sort of scientific way, in a numerical way, for example, that you can begin to describe the world in order to change it. I think there's a wonderful, long and noble history there of researchers being on the side of the public in defining and shaping and explaining what are things going on that affect them, whether it's cases of food poisoning, or whether it's changes in global temperature that are altering their farming yields, or whether it's counting the existence of rape in marriage. I mean, it's these are things that researchers have enabled, and I think seeing yourselves first as the researchers who do that is public service, I suppose, is a good step forward. I don't think solving the problem of our lack of confidence in authorities I think that's a political thing, and I think it's very important that researchers don't over-internalize that as a problem of science. It's when they're in the sort of political domain, scientists, that they find themselves subject to the same anti-politics movements and trends.
Okay, thank you very much. So we move back to Maria, and I hope.
Thank you very much.
Your screen.
I think it's working now.
And if you like to, you can also switch on your video so we can see you while you're talking. Perfect. Thank you. Floor is yours.
So apologies for that unexpected glitch in running the Zoom connection. And thank you for Tracy for taking over at such a short notice. What I'm saying follows on nicely from Tracy's and other talks. I'm Maria Baghramian from University College Dublin, and much of what I discuss is connected with the work that PERITIA, our research project on policy expertise and trust, is currently doing. So as all three speakers have indicated, the general perception that there is a low level of trust in science is not really borne out by surveys. However, I think once we look at specific areas of science, there are danger signs, and we should be wary of them and pay attention to them. And in order to do that, I think we should not just be focusing on trust, but also looking at distrust. So in order to contend with today's questions of this particular session, I'd like to look at the factors that would enable us to understand the phenomenon of distrust in science rather than trust. Although the numbers of people who distrust in science is quite low, comparatively speaking, but their effect is quite pernicious. And COVID and compliance with the various recommendations of scientists and health experts on its requirements gives us a striking example of the differences between trust and distrust. So one interesting result that Christina Bicchieri and her colleagues have recently published is that trust in science, even more than trust in a prevailing political system, improves compliance with COVID health guidelines. So you don't need to really trust your political regime or the politicians. It is quite adequate to trust in science in order to comply with general health guidelines on scientific advice, and particularly when it comes to COVID. But the converse is also the case. Distrust, rather than having a more neutral attitude towards science, has catastrophic consequences for public health measures. And vaccine resistance is a particularly pernicious example of distrust. So that's what I would like to concentrate on. But what the takeaway point of this short talk is that trust and distrust are not unitary entities. They are not unitary attitudes, and we should really understand them more contextually rather than generalizing about them. So there's no single model, in my view, that can counter distrust. There are different motivations and reasons for distrust, and we should look at least the key ones among them in detail. So I'm going to mention 3 cases. I could have gone up to 5 maybe, but for brevity and short and time limits, I'll just stick to 3. The first reasons for distrust in vaccinations, I categorize that under the general heading of worldview. And this is nothing new. This goes back to well before the COVID pandemic. And the components of a worldview are things like religious views, certain sets of beliefs, for instance, New Age beliefs, and general anti-medication, anti-pharmaceutical. So for religious views, for instance, Orthodox Jewish communities in Israel and in New York had very strong anti-vaccine views. But as we'll see just at the end of this talk, there's a very happy story to be told about that particular attitude. The New Age beliefs, for instance, in yoga communities influenced by, just to take one example, by Guru Ramdev in India, there has been a spread of these New Age ideas against vaccines, and they're having a pernicious effect on vaccine uptake in COVID cases, and also generally believing in natural healing processes rather than going for chemicals, an opposition to putting chemicals into your body. Second source of distrust, and a very unfortunate one, is political positioning. The Republican Party in the US is a prime example of this, where they have increasingly adopted an anti-science posture. I think the source of this posture is actually not COVID, not masks, but the major donors to the party who are against climate change measures. But once you start distrusting one area of science, then it's easy, particularly with a populist president at the helm, it becomes easier to spread that distrust to other areas of science. And thirdly, and very crucially, there are good reasons for distrusting science by some minority groups, and in one case a majority group, namely women, because of historic injustices inflicted on them. And again, 3 cases. the experience of Black minorities with medical practices, particularly in the US and UK, vaccines in particular. Tuskegee case is a famous example, but there are many others. Also, the use by CIA of the cover of science for political purposes, for instance, vaccination as a cover for intelligence gathering in Pakistan. And that explains the vaccine hesitancy of Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups in UK, at least to some extent. And then women's experiences with healthcare systems, and Ireland is a good example of that. While in Ireland there is a very willing uptake of vaccinations, 85% of people are very willing to take up vaccination, and only 6% are vaccine hesitant. There is a smaller number of vaccines uptake, or there's greater hesitance on part of women. And I think that's explained by the way women have been treated by Irish medical system over the past 100 years or so. Mother and baby homes is a particularly terrible example where there were vaccine experiments. So given that distrust has so many different sources and different reasons, how are we going to cope with it and deal with it? So this is the solution I'm discussing here, and with PERITIA is a longer term project rather than an immediate answer to the problem of distrust. So we do need to link distinct sources of distrust with the requirements of trustworthiness, and to emphasize that once we are pinpointing a source of distrust, then we also have to look at the requirement of trustworthiness in that special area. We also should not look for an effective model of science communication only, but or what I call the megaphone model, but work towards building a climate of trust where different causes of distrust are addressed appropriately and situationally. And we can learn from the successes and failures of COVID examples of building trust. So one very successful example I want to highlight is how Israel persuaded reluctant Orthodox Jews to get vaccinated against COVID-19. That's a title from an NPR broadcast, 5 minutes listening time only. And I do recommend you to take a look at it and how they used various measures to really convince the Orthodox rabbis to recommend vaccination, and that worked very well for Israel. Now, we can't replicate exactly the same measures, but we can learn from the success case. And finally, this work, as usual, has received funding from the European Union Horizon 2020 research project of PERITIA. Thank you very much.
Maria, thanks to you, and thanks for showing us your perspectives about the origins and backgrounds of distrust. I was just thinking about this famous notion of the risk society that was introduced in the 1980s by Ulrich Beck. And I was just wondering whether, okay, you explained the reasons for distrust, but whether you could also reflect a little bit about the functions of distrust that distrust might have. Did you think about that in one way or the other? Probably
yes, indeed. So trust always involves taking a risk. When we trust, we make ourselves vulnerable. That's built into the definition of trust. And what are we making ourselves vulnerable towards? Well, certain risks. It could be risks of chemicals. It could be risks of, in the COVID vaccine case, it could be the risk of being misled by authorities, yet again, etc., etc. Now, one thing about risks is that human beings are not very good at making assessments of risks. In fact, we have lots of different biases that we bring into our assessment of risk, and we should not expect more rationality than we are capable of. So there's no point in giving huge statistics about what is risky and what is not. We have to find ways of coping with our inability to being good risk calculators.
Thanks very much. So I would like to open the discussion, and I would like to ask all of you to switch on your videos again. Thank you. And John, I think you wanted to respond to this question too. Maybe you can share your perspective.
Sorry, could you just repeat the specific question?
So I was wondering, after Maria talked about the reasons or the origins of distrust, I was wondering whether distrust also has some kind of societal function, and if we shouldn't think about the importance of distrust more than the importance of trust, maybe. So
it's tricky for me because, so if I, as like a survey researcher, I'm curious. I don't know that I've ever tried, and I'm not sure how I would measure distrust separately from trust, right? And so for me, it's sort of a continuum from I think you're completely dishonest to you're completely honest, or I think you're completely uncaring to you're very caring. And so you could imagine that, but there is a potential that sort of like the negative stuff is more powerful, so like a non-linear kind of effect. But I mean, absolutely trust when people hold incorrect beliefs or hold correct beliefs that somebody is dishonest, that's very useful, right? And so we want people to try to make sense of the world the best way they can. And so if their best understanding of the world is that, you know, some scientist is dishonest or unwilling to listen or motivated by selfish interests, that's a thing we would want to know, and that's a thing that if it's true we would want to fix, and if it's not true we'd want to find out if there's a way to make those, to, I don't want to say correct the beliefs, but to share why we think we should be seen as honest or open or caring. Thank you. So I have another question that fits quite nicely to the issue of distrust and links to conspiracy theories. So Sophie Eschler is asking, often people who believe in conspiracy theories are not open to listen to counter arguments and only speak about talking points they have been given by the science denial community. What can we do to make people open to constructive discussion? So I would like to, before we ask for the what can we do, I would like to maybe ask Rainer if you know how these processes work and why people believe in conspiracy theories and cannot be convinced by other arguments. Maybe a psychological perspective could be interesting there.
First of all, I would like to start with a short comment on the trust-distrust relationship, and this is related to your question. At least with regard to the data from the German surveys, distrust and trust is not a continuum. So to a certain degree, I would contradict what John said, because there are different reasons people have for trust and distrust. It's not that it's a lack of the one reason is an argument in favor of the other reason. What the German surveys show is that distrust decisions are mainly based by violations on observations or on cues about violations against the rules of integrity and benevolence, while trust judgments are mainly based on cues with regard to expertise. And this relates to a certain degree also to this conspiracy issue, because people who are prone to conspiracy beliefs are often people who are focused more on these distrust-oriented cues than on the trust-oriented cues. This is one point. The other point is that, especially when it comes to conspiracy beliefs, this is often a case of or personal identity is a very strong factor for that. Believing in conspiracy belief, or also in other strange beliefs, like, for example, flat earthers. The belief in the flat earth is not only a belief about how the world is, but it's also part of the membership, to be a membership of a community.
Okay, I think this, is there any, Maria, sorry.
Yeah, so 2 points. Yes, I agree with Rainer that various surveys, at least in Europe, make a distinction between trust and distrust. There's one survey about trust in science, which showed that Russia has the highest level of trust in science, but also highest level of distrust in science, which is a very interesting phenomenon. But on conspiracy theories, there are, I think, two main ways of thinking about conspiracy theories, and that's in the literature. One is to think that the conspiracy theories are in the business of explaining what's happening, for instance, with COVID, but in an alternative way. And some may be doing that. But I don't think that's the right way to think about conspiracies. There's a second way of analyzing conspiracy theories, and various authors like Akil Bilgrami has done that, that conspiracy theories are actually a political act. To subscribe to them, you're in fact showing your allegiance to certain political positions, and that could be oppositional political positions in third world countries, in Iran, in Egypt, etc. Conspiracy theories actually are ways of showing your opposition to the government, but also in America, more and more conspiracy theories have become a badge of your political identity rather than an explanatory framework. And if you look at conspiracy theories in that way, then stop trying to convince people that they are wrong on scientific basis. You have to convince them on some other basis.
Great, thank you. Tracy wants to add. Great.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few questions about this. I think we have to make a distinction between what we're looking at with the COVID conspiracy theories, for example, is a bit different from what Maria just described when they have political currency. And the political currency tends to take off the more that you see that adherence to a particular conspiracy theory upsets the people you want to upset, then the more likely you're going to carry on with it. So we have to kind of see those dynamics in a different way. If we look at something like sense making, and I think the work of Peter Knight on this is really useful, because as a sense making exercise, it's not much different from the way that most of us try and make sense of the world. And as Rainer said, in terms of sense of belonging to a particular group and so on. But I think control is a really important thing that often gets forgotten. And when I was referring earlier to sort of our different positions, and if you're a professional, I wasn't just referring to the sort of the mean, that you have money in the bank and you can pay your rent, but the control that comes with that. And that sense of, even knowing things like the difference between the executive and the legislature in your government, and knowing that they have different roles to play, in knowing things like where the accountability mechanisms are, or that there's an ombudsman or a complaint channel. And, there's a real difference in levels of control and familiarity with mechanisms of control in the world. And I think that's a really useful starting point. And when you want to help people, we're assuming here, we're talking about people who do have questions. One of the things that we want to encourage is that skeptical thinking people, critical people, people who want more control of the world, and why shouldn't they, right? That they are waylaid by David Icke and people like that, who are really egomaniacs, who just want more click money and more kind of the Billy Graham type, big ticket presentations. And they take them nowhere. They take those questions absolutely nowhere. And I think that's your strongest point when you're trying to help people come through this. These questions, these sorts of adherences will take you nowhere, and they don't trouble authorities at all. And that's what I think we need to encourage people. If you've got good questions, and there are things that need answers, and there are questions of power and control, and you won't achieve anything with them by just becoming the clapping audience for a few self-appointed conspiracy theorists.
Thank you. That leads a tiny bit away from science, but we go back to science and go back to COVID. Because Maria also related to COVID in her talks, and we have quite some questions and some surprises. So people from Italy who are surprised that the trust in science has been rising during the COVID pandemic, or David Domingo from Belgium, who says that there was an increase in trust, but then there also was a backlash. And he asked, as a matter of fact, scientists did not agree on the policies that should be recommended. So the challenge for the media was double, reporting uncertain science and social backlash at the same time. So he relates to the role that the media play in this And often we, of course, talk about the fragmentation of the public sphere. We see that, for instance, in the US, people tend more and more to social media, but still, what is the role of media in this context? John, maybe that's a question for you.
What is the, so I have to admit, so what is the role of media? I'm not, so it's a tricky thing for me, because I would say that the role of media, I think about the role of scientists to share, in the scientific community, to share what how they're thinking, what they're thinking, their motives, and the role of the media then is to report that in a critical way. And so I don't think of the media should do a good job reporting on what people are saying, not overplaying conspiracy theorists, they're not overplaying, they should do their job as reporters. I don't think of them as, it's funny because I think in terms of strategic communication, the media is the group I don't want to be strategic. I want them to be thinking like, well, what is this group saying, and what's the evidence that they're correct, and checking that stuff. And so it's tricky for me that I always wonder about the role of the media. The role of media is to serve as a mediator between the key players in society, but not just a perfect, like not just a pipe, but a sort of a critical mediator between the scientific community and other communities and the broader communities in which we all live.
Okay, and if we add what's the role of scientists, because they also, of course, use social media. So scientists are very active on Twitter, are active on Reddit, are active on whatever. So how can they then make their voices heard in this community, in this media environment?
Yeah, and I go back to this. So then I go back to this question of the conspiracy thing, which is the thing I was thinking when we were talking about conspiracy is what I really worry about is scientists going rogue. And so, and Tracy talked a little bit about this, of there's lots of potential for harm. And so the scientists should share what they know and why they know it in a way that fosters honesty, integrity, caring. They should talk about their motivations. So they should do all those things. What they shouldn't do is take it on themselves to go attack people who they think are saying the wrong things. They shouldn't take it on themselves to go out and be vigilantes for science. I think there's lots of work that we need to do to deal with misinformation, disinformation. But then we go back to like, well, what's the scientific community? How do we structure that? What's the role of scientific societies? What's the role of foundations? What's the role of government? But individual scientists, I worry a lot about them going rogue, being jerks.
Maria.
Yeah, if I can add something to what John and Tracy were saying on this topic. So there's uncertainty is built into science. We can't do anything about that. So is disagreement. And then individual scientists do go rogue. We have seen this in Ireland, and most of you have seen it in your own countries as well. So again, we cannot control them. They can't even be fired if they have tenure. But what I think we could do is to emphasize the role of consensus in science. And that's what Thomas Kuhn, for instance, had called normal science. So in a time of crisis, we want normal science. And how do we establish what is normal science? Well, where the majority of scientists agree on, rather than emphasizing the view of one individual. And that's where the media comes in, because unfortunately, media gives parity of voice to both sides of the debate, where there is no both sides. There's one rogue scientist and then hundreds of others who are on the opposite side. So in trying to be even-handed, the media can do damage actually to the question of knowledge of science.
You know, that hits to the problem of false balance in journalism. Yeah, thank you for that. Tracy, there's one question for you that fits quite nicely. So the question is, how do you motivate skeptics, but also the general public more broadly, to participate and engage in asking questions with scientists? So we have the scientists who are quite active, and we have the Science March, and scientists are encouraged to go to the public and engage with the people. But how do you engage people to join this dialogue?
I think this is goes to a really big, broad question that I know a lot of scientists really concerned about, and also I pick up in some of the questions. People want to talk about schools a lot, and I think scientists often end up thinking about schools. I mean, it's great to talk about schools, but schools have a lot of pressure on them already to equip people with the sort of settled knowledge of science, and I've always feel like we're giving up if we just kind of jump and skip to the next generation and sort of almost say, well, what can we do about this current discussion? Nothing. Let's just try and inoculate people with knowledge for the future. And of course that won't work either, because it's not about that. I think the useful way to think of the public is not so much of the science interested and the science uninterested, because if you survey the public and you ask that question, most of them answer according to whether they liked science at school. It's useful to think of people as having flashpoints. They have moments in their lives when they are interested and they want to know, and it might be because they've just read a story in the press about 5G and mobile phones, or it might be because they're thinking about who to vote for, or it might be because they have a personal question about why a relative can't get residential care for an alcohol problem. Is that because the evidence doesn't support it, or is it because the funding doesn't support it? They might have a question like that, or just a general interest. But they have a moment when they ask the question, and the question scientists should be asking themselves is, are we where they go? Are we there? If you Google that question, if you come looking for information, are we there? Are we responding? And is it in a frame? Because those questions are not asking, that people don't want to go back through a sort of, in the beginning was the cell, and then we go on from there, and then we arrive at the vaccine policy, right? The question they will ask you is a complicated one with multiple assumptions underneath it. And there's quite a lot of work to do to unpack that and to think about how to take people on the journey from their question to your research, not from an interest in your research to the answer to that question. And I think if you start thinking that way, you see more opportunities for the points of engagement, and you feel less despairing, because you don't have to make people come right back to the lab with you or right back to school with you. You just start together on their question. Maybe that sort of begins to answer some of the empathy questions that people are also asking.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a very strong focus on industrialized countries and the west of the world. Maybe one question to John and Rainer. Do you have data for trust in science, and for instance, in Africa, in Asia? So there's one person asking especially for examples of Cuban citizens' trust in science. Do you know something about that? Just to
I don't know Cuba, so it would the best resource would be the international survey that Gallup did with the Wellcome Trust last year, and I don't know whether Cuba was in that. I would doubt it, but lots of other countries are. Lots of countries in Africa, lots of countries in Asia. Specific countries. So I used to write the national report for the United States, and so I got to spend a lot of time on this. And then they're sort of sporadic, right? There's like China has a big one, but it's very focused on science literacy. They do a crazy one. I said it's 75,000 people or something. Japan does one occasionally. Korea does one occasionally. I don't know, Rainer, do you have other sense of ones that are around the world?
No, I would just also refer to that big Wellcome study. I think what can be learned from our discussion so far is that since trust in science is so closely related to the science politics and relationship within a specific society, it's no surprise that what is trust in science and how much people have trust in science is so different between different parts of the world, because trust in science, and this is one of my main points at all, is to a very much degree not under the control of scientists. Trust in science is to, I think also today we had a lot of examples pointing to the very fact that the general public's trust of science depends only to a relatively small degree from what scientists do. It depends very strong from how, for example, politicians and other stakeholders deal with science and with a system of science. And in terms of that, it is, I think, is very, since this is very different between different countries all over the world, we can expect a lot of variance, not only with regard to the amount, but also with regard to the, I would say, content or main issues when it comes to trust in science.
Maria, what is your perspective? So if we link this to the science policy nexus, is trust in science first and foremost a political strategy?
So I mentioned this recent study by Christina Bicchieri, which is quite counterintuitive from my perspective, in that I had always thought that there would be a strong link between trust in science and trust in political institutions. But in fact, her study, which is based on 6 or 7 countries, and hopefully it will be replicated, shows that no, trust in science can be an independent variable. And even if you don't trust in politicians, you can, through trusting in science, you can follow advice on COVID cases. That was her particular area of study. So I would like to see if that particular study is replicated, and if indeed we can separate trust in science from trust in politics, as I used to think it would be possible.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we come to the end, but we have an interesting question I think Tracy wanted to answer, and maybe we can just link this to a closing round where everybody gives his take-home messages, more or less. So this question is from Bijan Kafi, and he says, we need to be extremely careful with the uncertainty is built into science narrative. Yes, that's technically correct, but science and scientists also have exceptionally high expectation with regard to their authority to speak truth to society. Is there a double speak? The result can quickly ruin trust in science too. So maybe Tracy starts and tries to link her closing remarks with her response to the question, and then I would like to hand over to the rest of you.
So I think what Bijan's getting at is a really important point, is that being honest about uncertainty doesn't mean that you become cagey in your way of presenting what you're doing. And I think that's it's quite important that the sort of anxiousness that scientists have in front of their peers about being seen to overstep or something, or just saying, well, we can never be sure. I think sometimes, you just need to look at the question that people are trying to answer and have that conversation about how well equipped are we to answer it? Have we got the material we need to answer the question, and how confidently, rather than to sort of just keep turning in circles on levels of uncertainty in the research. So again, the focus on questions. So that's where I just really want to end up is if you focus on the questions that we're trying to answer, and you explain why they're important questions to answer and how we break them down into testable things that we can try and answer and approximate an answer from scientific research, I think you always go the right way and end up in the right kind of conversations. And that's what I would really encourage people to focus on. I think you end up in the same place as the public, because at the end of the day, we're all about asking questions.
Thanks very much. John, what's your main?
Yeah, I really like that answer. I'll say we have research that shows that communicating uncertainty doesn't seem to negatively affect trust or trustworthiness beliefs. I mean, there's studies here, there's study there, but overall, people get it. People understand that science is a process for the most part. More broadly, though, I think coming back to some of the other conversations around politics and what we can do, I would argue that the key thing to recognize is that what are the things that we have as members of the scientific community have control over? What can we do? First, we can behave in trustworthy ways. We've got to do that. As we're doing that, we can share the things that we're doing to make sure that our work has integrity. We can share the things that we're doing to make sure that we're listening to people. We can talk about our pro-social motivations. And to a lesser extent, we can share, people aren't that worried about our abilities, but we can share those things. Those are things that we as individual scientists can do through our words and our behaviors. They're also things that scientific organizations can prioritize. And so for me, it's that, yeah, there's going to be lots of stuff we can't control, but the things we can control, we should.
Thank you. Maria.
So there are deep philosophical issues involved in this question. So I'll just give a make a stab at them very briefly. So what is it that scientists do? I think the best explanation of what science is doing is that they're trying to provide the best explanation possible. And then how do we know that this links with truth? Well, the best explanations also do work out in the real world. So the best explanation of how flight is possible enables us to build airplanes that do fly, and the best explanations about gravity, etc., enables us to build bridges that don't fall. So there's a two-stage process. And the best explanation at any given time will be open to rejection later on, as it has happened throughout the history of science. And yet that's all we have at our disposals, or all that the scientists have at any given time. And consensus comes in there, what we consider to be the best explanation. These are provisional, but they do link with truth. Otherwise, bridges will fall and airplanes won't fly, etc., etc.
Thank you. Rainer, the last minute is for you.
My final comment is totally in line with what John emphasized. I would argue that the strength and the main task of science is producing knowledge, and that means and insights or causal explanations. And this implies that the main challenges but also opportunities for producing trust in science or for fostering trust in science is by fostering epistemic trust in science, and much less recommendation oriented, as Tracy said, trust in science, because recommendations, they are only under very specific circumstances tasks of scientists.
Thank you very much. I stop with a famous definition by Niklas Luhmann, who said that trust is a mechanism to reduce complexity. What we saw today is that trust itself is a quite complex issue. And I would like to continue this discussion in one way or the other to a later point of time. So thanks to all the speakers for joining us today. Thanks to the audience and the questions. And have a good afternoon and have a good further conference. Goodbye.